Hi, Homeworthy. I'm Brittany. Welcome to my home here in New York. Come on in.
You're watching Homeworthy, where we believe every home has a story.
Hi, I'm Brittany Bromley. I'm an interior designer, and welcome to my home here in Bedford, New York. When I first saw this home, it was 2009, and it had a lot of deferred maintenance. Unfortunately, the previous owners had lived here for 40 years, and I think as people are apt to do, you sort of stop seeing the issues. And so there were a lot of things that were necessary to both bring it up to date, but also to sort of make it something that was aesthetically pleasing. So we did about 6 months of renovations, a lot of which we did ourselves, which was lots of fun and very illuminating as to what is required to make something like this truly shine. And I looked at it as a 30-year project. I wasn't daunted by the amount of deferred maintenance, but certainly if I were to see it now as opposed to 15 years ago, I might have had a little bit less energy to put towards it. So this home dates back to 1790, which is just about 2 years after the burning of Bedford, New York. So it was one of the few structures in town that actually survived. And as a result of that, it is a home, like most old homes, that was added on to as the requirements of the people occupying it changed. So it started as a very classic center hall colonial, 2 up and 2 down. And we actually have some really amazing character details from that era, one of which would have been their primary source of sort of cooking fire, which is the massive dining fireplace area, which still has a very cool old, what you would have used to put like a soup tureen on and off of the fire. But the house, because it had so many different iterations, there's not a single straight line in sight. The entire space, I mean, my wallpaper guy wants to kill me. There's a 4.5-inch difference between one side of the kitchen and the other. And, you know, if you dropped a marble, you'd never find it again. So here we are in the living room, and this space, believe it or not, was probably in the best condition of any room in the home. So one of the challenges was, because it wasn't in the same sort of sense of deterioration as some of the others, was to reimagine it in a way that made sense for us. So one of the things about this room that I really loved is that it has these incredible old, very wide plank wood floors. And we have that in several of the rooms of this home on this first floor. But this room to me felt something about how large it was and the expanse of it. These floors almost felt like they needed to be considered separately. And so the design concept for this room started to come about as a result of figuring out what I wanted these floors to feel like. My amazing, incredible decorative painter, Mary Mead Evans, and she did a Parquet de Versailles. We worked very closely to figure out what sort of tone this floor would be, and it is the only room in our home that has this light wash on it. And I wanted it to feel, in a sense, almost Parisian. And so not only was the pattern selected for that reason, but also then from there, because every decision narrows your next decision when it comes to design, that was also how I decided to do the boiserie on the walls. So the walls in this room are done with appliqued wood molding in a boiserie finish, and then this paint color was also done as a decorative paint color. And anyone that's ever worked with me as a painter knows that I like to see about 95 options before I settle on that which is perfect, and this was no different. So God bless Mary for sticking with me on this, because this sort of pale peachy color to me is one of the most flattering colors in the world, and it feels both light and bright and somehow modern. And because every decision then narrows the next, I felt that the upholstery in this room needed to be strong enough that it could stand up to the quietness of the walls. So I started in this area with the concept of having a dark sofa, and I chose a very traditional George Smith sofa. And to me, they're the most beautiful, sort of old-fashioned, wonderful, traditional, and it's covered in a really amazing chocolate brown mohair, which is really tactile and really comfortable, and also gives it the interest of when things are sort of moved around on something like mohair, it gives it a sheen, and that's a really interesting thing to me. The hero fabric in this room, which is what we call sort of the multicolor fabric that brings everything else in the space together, is this gorgeous silk from Benison. Benison is one of my most favorite fabric houses. They have the most incredible things. And to me, this is an incredible fabric. Just disturb Banksy here to show you. Because it's almost painterly in the way that it is a hand done set of florals, and because it has all of these colors in it, and yet it has a very quiet oyster silk background, it allows us to sort of use all of those colors throughout the room. So this is the main area, and then over here we have my collection, which is what we call when we're an interior designer and we can't stop shopping, of all of the things that I really love. And so to me, that means things like tortoiseshell boxes, opaline glass, and lots of sort of what we refer to in the business as objet, which means that if I see it and I want it, I get to add it to the collection. And that's very special to me. And the idea in a room like this, where everything is very pale, to me, of using something dark like this table, it's a very grounding effect. And you'll see throughout this space that I've used black in that way to pull sort of the lightness of some of these other things back to the ground and ground them. So you'll see like these beautiful lampshades all have little bits of black. And then our favorite chair, this is one of my most favorite things in the whole house, is covered in this gorgeous quadrille fabric. And it just makes me happy every time I see it. And this is the vista that I see when I walk by this room, is this chair from the hallway. So it makes me very happy. These are antique French bergère. And to me, there's really never not a good case to be made for animal print. And this animal print, because there are many, happen to work perfectly with this sort of pearl oyster color of the walls and this deep chocolate brown. And again, because it's a velvet, it does have the ability to change a little bit in sheen. And that to me makes it more interesting, because use and patina and things like that are always things to which I gravitate. I also have a real fondness for, and therefore quite a collection of antique oil paintings. And this room is a room that sort of displays my fondness for these things. So throughout the space, you'll see these beautiful oil paintings that I've been collecting for quite some time. This mantelpiece was actually quite controversial, believe it or not. When I bought this home, this is the mantel that was in place. And there was a lot of discussion around, because it is a Central Hall Colonial dating back to 1790, whether this particular wood piece and this detailing would have been used in that era. And the answer is no. But to me, what's really lovely about having a home that has had multiple iterations and has expanded throughout history is the idea that that historical aspect to it is layers that are added on top of it. So my goal when we restored this home wasn't to bring it back to feeling as though it were 1790. It was to display the fact that this is a home that has stood the test of time. And then to further play with sort of proportion and scale, I found another wonderful old oil painting, and this one happens to be of a little girl. I have two little girls, and so we always say that this is my girl with flowers. So both of my girls really love this. One of the things we get to do a lot here in Bedford is take walks in the preserve. And so this is actually an old mercury glass vase, and all of these feathers are feathers that I've found throughout the course of my time here in Bedford. So they're a little bit of a trophy, and I love them. And then I'm also always very drawn to natural textures like horn and this sort of natural color variation associated with that. So this pair of horns is an antique set that I bought many, many years ago. And I have to be honest, they have a beautiful silver base, which requires regular polishing if you're someone who doesn't like patina. I happen to love patina, and therefore they only get done every once in a while, because I like the idea that they don't feel terribly new and that they are something that is a living finish. This dog statue actually belonged to my grandmother Gigi, who had really beautiful homes and really incredible style, and probably genetically gave me more information in that regard than I'm even aware of. But this was something that belonged to her, and she passed away when I was in my early 20s, and this little guy has been with me from every home I've ever had since then, and because of that will always have sort of a pride of place wherever I am. One of the things about a home to me that is important is that it not feel too precious and that it not feel too done, because the concept behind what I would like to do and what I do as it relates to just having published a book titled this is that there is such a thing as relaxed elegance. And so even though I have lampshades in this room that are 100% silk and hand pin tucked and have all of this detail, I also love the juxtaposition between something like a hand-blocked batik. And so the ability for me to wave something like that into this space and ground it with this inlaid black and cream lamp, to me makes everything in the room more interesting. On this wall, we have another thing to which I gravitate and therefore have a nice collection, and that is reverse painted églomese. Églomese is an incredible mirror technique where you reverse paint a mirror, and so you get not only this gorgeous thing that they've created, but you also get where they have removed the back of that mirror and where it is something where it's still solid. So it gives the entire piece of art this really interesting, again, patina, to which I obviously gravitate. This little corner of the space in our living room, I will say, was a design challenge. And I like to say that there are no challenges. It's more about opportunity. And I wanted it to function in a way that would allow, when I was entertaining, for people to sort of break away from the main seating area and have sort of what we would refer to as a tete-a-tete, which means like a little private conversation in a space where the entire group is not gathered, but without leaving the room. So this is a custom corner piece, which I had upholstered in this beautiful chocolate brown and white Schumacher silk. And then I did a bullion fringe, and these pillows obviously are the hero fabric in our room, which is the Benison, and they have this incredible Decor de Paris trim on them, and it is, we call it the caterpillar in our office because we love it so much. It comes in many wonderful colors, but it's very tactile, and I love that about it. Another thing that was important to me about this space in general here in the living room, but also most of my home, is that we don't have a lot of overhead light. This room doesn't have any for the most part. And so having various sources of light at different heights is very important to the overall ambiance. And so instead of having to worry about having another set of side tables here to serve this, having these floor lamps with the green silk shades eliminated that problem and gave us the ability to have this function as a space that was lit appropriately. So one of the opportunities about this space is that because this home had been added onto over time, what had started out as a much larger living room, which was entirely rectangular in nature and expanded out like this, ended up being carved up by a previous owner so that we could accommodate some modern amenities, for which I'm grateful, like washer dryer. But it meant that this room was no longer functioning in the same space. And so these two rooms are separate rooms in the sense that they have different functions in our lives, but they are adjoining, and putting a door into either would have changed sort of the flow. And so my solution to that was to use our incredible hero fabric from Penison and create a very sort of dramatic doorway using this drape fabric. But one of the things that was important to me is that these two spaces have different color palettes, but also be able to always sort of relate to one another because they are open. And so when you'll see when we move into this room is that we chose to do this side of the curtain in this gorgeous silk in the Penison, and then we chose to do the reverse side in this green gingham so that both, when seen from the opposite room, make sense. So now we're in the adjoining space to the formal living room, and this is by far sort of one of the more interesting parts of our home as it relates to color scheme. I think you probably know by now that I'm not afraid of color, and this room demonstrates that aptly. The first thing that I chose for this space is this marbleized wallpaper from Lee Joffa. It is such an interesting combination of colors that you don't always see together. And I've always loved marbleized fabrics and papers and books because it creates such a beautiful organic movement to it. This is not a large room, and as you can see, a lot of this room is doors and windows. And so the ability to have this paper sort of hold its own against all of that negative space was very important. Because this has such an interesting mix of colors, it allowed me to sort of go nuts in the Crayola box as it relates to what we did in this space. So the first thing I did was to choose this really dark green, but what you'll note about this color green, which it took me again several tries to figure out in the sample department, is that it has a lot of yellow in it and very little blue. And because of that, it doesn't read as a Kelly. It's much more olive, or as the case may be, since this is the name, more of a bonsai. And it gives us a little bit warmer, richer feeling than something that's more traditionally Kelly green might do. From there, I layered in my most favorite color, other than verdigris. Don't ask my poor children who had to learn how to spell that for all their like kindergarten reviews. They all know it by heart now though, is this incredible Pierre Frey saffron velvet. And it was really important to me because this room is often viewed from the formal living room, that this space be framed out in a way where these curtains were doing a lot of work in here. And this bright color and this sort of intense color saturation is really important as far as how this room functions. Next up on the hit parade is our incredible Lee Joffa fabric. So this sofa is the perfect size, and this is a custom piece that I had designed. And I wanted this to be a space where we could sort of retire after dinner, have drinks. When a few people have gone home and the party gets a little bit smaller and maybe a little bit more interesting, it lets everybody sort of sit in this more intimate space. So I wanted to be able to enjoy it with my children, but I also wanted to be able to hang out with friends in here. So this space was conceived with that in mind. And one of the things that I do quite often, which I think is very functional and therefore is one of the things that we probably do most for other people, is we created an ottoman that's firm enough for us to put a drink down on, but soft enough for us to put our feet up on. And because this is a tight space, you sort of have to think about the functionality of the space in addition to the aesthetic. And so what we often do is create a custom trivet tray, as we've done here, so that when we have lots of people in here and some people have their feet up, we've got some place we can put a drink down, and we've got some additional sort of space for entertaining purposes. One of the other things for which I'm well known and therefore have profligate amounts in my home is pattern lampshades. This particular set really spoke to me because not only does it have this very specific green, but it is also pulling in a bit of the saffron color. And I love that about it. What you'll notice here is one of many in my home. Have a real love for needlepoint pillows. This one happens to illustrate my point perfectly, which is too much of a good thing is wonderful. So that is something that is always sitting there and frankly quite true. In addition to that, one of the things that I like to do when I have a space that has a lot of negative space, which is what happens when you have a large window, is I like to hang something either on top of it or adjacent to it so that it gives you sort of a frame of reference for the space itself. In this particular room, I've chosen one of my favorite things. This is a paper mache mirror by Casa Gusto. And I think what is so wonderful about it, besides this great color and the detail and the fact that it's 3D, is that it gives you a frame of reference in the negative space around this window. And so that makes it probably a lot more interesting than it would be if it were on something that was solid. As I explained, this room functions as an addendum to the formal living room. And because of that, we did choose some of the colors so that they would be repetitious. But maybe the most important thing that I did to combine these two spaces is to use the same color in high gloss lacquer on this ceiling as I did on the walls in the main room. So those two sorts of senses of connection, besides this beautiful open entryway with these curtains, I think make this room feel separate from, but also related to, its neighbor. So here we are in the main event, which is the center hall of the Center Hall Colonial here in our home in Bedford. And I would say one of the things about this space that to me was very important is the idea that because the entertaining rooms are off of this, that this room felt sort of traditionally formal in the sense that I wanted you to know that you'd arrived. And so one of the ways that we accomplished that was by having this floor painted out in a very traditional checkerboard. This is something that, would have been done in the day, often in a material like marble, so that you had this sort of elevated feel. In our case, we have really wonderful old wood floors, and so for us it was natural for it to stay this chocolate brown and then to weave in this sort of creamy white that didn't feel too cold. One of the other things I did in this space, because it is very much a connector, but I also want that sense of arrival, is that I chose to do this really terrific Schumacher wallpaper, which has a little bit of reflectivity to it, which to me is very important because, again, this is one of the few overhead lights in my home. So most of the time when you're seeing these wall treatments, you're relying on light at a certain level to sort of carry you through. And this gives a really nice reflectivity with the sconces. This is one of my most favorite pieces ever. It is an antique French baking cabinet, and in its day it would have been used to sort of show like amazing fresh pastries and croissants and breads and things which had just been baked that day. In my case, it serves both a utilitarian function and also a decorative function, and that is that we keep a lot of our silver in here because I always just think it's more interesting to have a little bit of glint and interest. This holds not only things which are recently acquired and beautiful, but also things which have real sentimental value. And some of the things that we like to display here that I happen to have just picked up here are my baby cup from when I was younger, which fittingly reads The Big Event, my silver rattle, and the first silver dollar that I got when I lost my front teeth. So barely any time has passed since then. One of the other things about this space is that this door, which is a traditional Center Hall Colonial door, is actually one single piece of woodwork. So this entire casing, the windows around it, everything about this would have to be taken out or put back in one single piece, which just simply isn't done anymore. And so I used a heat gun to bring this door back from whence it had come, which was about 9 layers of paint, so that we could get to some of the beautiful molding and woodwork and architectural detail, which would have been more appropriate to its heritage. One of the other things I love about this little space, tiny and mighty though it may be, is the way that it connects the more formal spaces in my house. And so having things that sort of play with the idea of being relaxed and formal at the same time is always interesting to me. So I've chosen a really beautiful olive wood carved chair, which again, I love because of the interest in the negative and positive space. I've covered it in a pretty precious material. Just ask my children, who are not allowed to put wet umbrellas down on it. But then we've sort of played with the idea of it being a much more relaxed space by having these really beautiful paper mache from Casa Gusto, which have this almost sculptural feeling to them and a much more natural sort of rustic feeling. Additionally, this is the center hall of our home. And so this staircase is a main thoroughfare. And so in addition to being something which is required to be picturesque, it also has to take a real beating. And so having a natural texture on these stairs like this jute is very important to me, and I think it keeps it from feeling too precious. One thing that I detail in my book, which I think I'm probably very well known for, at least by my team, is that when I can't find something that I want, I make it. So in this instance, I had a vision for the color scheme that I wanted to have in this hallway. And this was this deep chocolate brown and then my favorite saffron yellow. And so I could not find any sort of ribbons or anything that existed that would work for this concept. So I made my own with a hot glue gun. I love the feeling of being the steward of a property that will endure long after I've gone on. And I think that this home has that feeling to it. We are able to love it and give it the attention it needs today, but in 30 or 40 years, I have a feeling that somebody else will be doing that. And the understanding that this house is so much older than we are and has seen so much more history than we will ever see is something I love. It makes me feel like we have, sort of a joyful obligation to make sure that it continues. One of the things that I love most about this house is the sort of authentic vintage charm. And vintage is something that applies to after a certain date, and this certainly is older than most things that we term vintage. But one of the things that we loved about it was the historic old glass in all of the windows. And as a result of that, we have extremely high heating bills because there is not a single window in sight that isn't probably older than 75 years. And it gives us that really beautiful, wavy old glass feeling. I would say that my sense of style ends up being that to which I respond. And so maybe it sort of defies categorization, but I have been called in the past a grand millennial and sort of classic with a kick. I love traditional design, but I am always looking for ways to make things that are traditional and therefore sometimes have a connotation of being staid or older, feel a little bit more young and vibrant. And I think we do that most often with pattern play and color. So welcome to the family room and also my most favorite hallway in our home, which happens to be this high gloss coral lacquer. I absolutely love this color. As you probably know by now, I absolutely love color, period, but I just find it to be so incredibly flattering and so beautiful, and I love the way it mixes with the chocolate brown and the cream of the floors. In our family room, which sort of began its life as the master bedroom for the people that lived here before we did, it was a very, very different feeling. There was a wall of closets, there was a skinny little window in the middle of the wall. There was a whole bunch of sort of faulty sliders. And one of the things that we did in this home is to put a really large number of French doors all the way around all of the first floor rooms on this home, because the gardens of this home are one of the things that really spoke to me when we were looking at purchasing it. So the ability to sort of open the doors and walk right out to the terrace all the way around the house was very important to me. This is one of the few rooms in the home where I haven't used a tremendous amount of color. So I used a Jofa fabric as our hero fabric in this room, and it has these sort of really interesting greens and blues and a little bit of this natural color. And so to me, I wanted this room to feel quiet and sort of like a restful respite. When it's not a dark and gloomy day, this room gets an extraordinary amount of light. And so it was easy to sort of conceptualize it in a way that made it feel light and bright, and I didn't have to use a ton of color in here. One of the most important design aspects of this room that I chose to do is I chose to do a hand-painted ceiling. And I went back and forth quite a bit as it relates to how we were going to achieve my vision. And what ended up settling me on this wallpaper, which has this beautiful sort of antique mirror silver foil finish, is that it allowed me to cover the entire space without a lot of seams in the paper. When we were looking at doing it in a traditional sense with plate glass mirror, there were going to be a lot of cuts in the mirror, and that wasn't something that I wanted. So I did this silver foil Philip Jeffries, and then I had my decorative painter hand paint the treillage in a way that allowed it to feel as though it's shadowed. And that sort of brightness and interest to the ceiling took away what some people might have said was a real issue with this room, which was a lot of ceiling height, and actually made it, in my opinion, something that functions as an asset to the space instead of a detraction. So the hero of this room, other than our multi-fabric, is this massive ottoman, which was so large we almost had to take the doors off their hinges to get it in here, and the last part of it had to be constructed en situ. But it is the most functional, amazing piece of furniture maybe that we have in our whole house. Not only is it, once again, sort of firm enough for you to put your drink or your sippy, as my girls call them, down, but it's also soft enough for all of us to put our feet up on. And I wanted it to be something that was reachable from every single seat in this room. And so it had to sort of be almost as large as the continent of the United States, and it functions in an amazing way for us. One of the things about having an ottoman this size is that you then also have to have an almost equal number of interesting things on the ottoman. So because I'm a designer and I'm constantly interested in this sort of thing, I have a really large collection of design books. So I chose to do sort of interesting piles around the space that had these like sort of wonderful, interesting color variation to them and interest. And then I've layered onto them things that are special to me. So I have this really incredible porcupine quill box, which is an antique box. I also have these incredible quartz sculptures, which my children think are very funny because they're precious mushrooms, but I love them and I love the color. And then one other thing I would say for which I'm very well known is that I'm not afraid of a large flower arrangement. So in this room, we always have something that's got some interest and some height. Right now it's spring, and so we have flowering quince, but when it's not this incredible and available to us, I always do something like either a dried eucalyptus, and then I always have lots of really interesting plants potted around the room with lots of different color variation, because I think it's important to sort of live with greenery, and you'll see that throughout the home. Another aspect of this room, which was different than some other spaces in the home, is that it doesn't have a wood floor. And so the decision for us to keep this a brick floor, which is a traditional sort of sunroom application of that material, and then to cover it in this incredible cotton custom durry. I love this durry so much. My amazing friends at From Jaipur with Love had this made for me. We went back several times about thread color, and this color just happened to be the exact thing that we needed. And something about a cotton durry, as opposed to some of the other things that I've done in the home that I think is really lovely, is that it always feels very relaxed. And this is probably the most relaxed room in our home, and we spend the most time in it, so I wanted it to be comfortable. Conversely, I also wanted to remember who I was, and so I had to have lots of different things in this room, and one of the things that I chose, which probably was a bit of a head scratcher in the beginning, but I think it's worked out, is this beautiful inlaid French chest. And so to me, what I love again is a juxtaposition of something that's very informal, like a hand block fabric. And then with that, you have something that has really interesting tonal variation because of the species of marble, and then really interesting detail in the woodwork, both in terms of color and also in terms of the fact that it has this very feminine, organic shape to it. This room has such a beautiful view out into our gardens that it took me about 12 years to figure out what artwork I could put on the walls that would stand up to the view outside. And I could not love the art more. They are these incredible framed prints. They're done in this seagrass matting, this incredible framing. The frame itself is a piece of art. Again, these are from my best friends at Casa Gusto, and they have such incredible taste. And I was so thrilled to be able to use these all the way around the room because I think they're interesting enough that they stand up to the view of the great outdoors from all the rest of the French doors and windows. So right off of this hallway, we have my favorite bathroom in the house. The reason it's my favorite is because it feels like a garden. And because I have so much color saturation in the adjoining hallway, which is the coral lacquer hallway, I wanted to play off of that color, but I also wanted to give you a little bit of a moment of relief. So I chose this incredible Pierre Fray wallpaper, which has some of those colors, but then also has this really deep, dark feeling, which I love. I did custom sconces, and honestly, I couldn't decide between black and white, so I've ended up with striped. And depending on the day, sometimes we'll have the black facing out, and sometimes we'll have the white. That's just a little bit about my insanity. And then everything else about this space just feels to me very much like a jewel box, and I love that about it. It's the one room of a home that you're almost always guaranteed to have a guest use, and that's the powder room. So it should be something special. One of the things that I would say is sort of consistent throughout my home is a mix of high-low. So this particular vanity is nothing special. It is just a woodwork piece, which I had painted in a lacquer black, but because I can't help myself and I look at hardware as jewelry, I have these incredible pieces of hardware from P.E. Guerin, which is just an incredible company in New York that does the finest, most gorgeous hardware. And I never, ever, ever come into this bathroom that I'm not happy that I splurged on this moment of luxury. So I'm a really interesting mix of left brain and right brain, because while I am a very creative person, I'm also very right brain in the sense that I'm very organized and very sort of by the book. And so the idea that in my current profession, which I feel like really is a calling, that's a place where I can use both sides of my sort of propensity has been a really wonderful thing for me. I began my life as a residential real estate agent in New York City. And now looking back in hindsight, a lot of the things that made me such a successful real estate broker, which were the ability to sort of communicate with my clients, understand their needs, and then match them to an appropriate property, are the same things that allow me to do what I do today. And I would say in that initial career, whether I realized it at that point or not, the idea of saying, maybe we could just change the swing of this door, or if you just took this wall down, then you would be able to understand how these spaces connect to each other. That was probably above and beyond that of what a normal broker might do, and sort of dipping a toe into what ended up becoming my life. So here we are in my dining room, which my children call Narnia, because it is covered in a completely sort of enveloping way in a 3D boiserie, which is done by my dearest friends at Casa Gusto. So they had just started working with paper mache with the idea of using it as wall treatment and ceiling treatment, and they were doing a room in their shop, and I saw it. And absolutely fell in love with it. And I'd been trying to figure out what sort of iteration was next for this dining room. And so Casa Gusto and Augie and I came up with this sort of tree of life pattern, which is a 3D set of branches and boiserie panels, which actually travels all the way around the space. And so not only does it have that three-dimensional aspect, which makes it really interesting and makes it feel almost magical, but it's a really complicated and incredible process that they've perfected, where, you know, this entire room was made in separate panels. There's 67 of them, and then pieced together on site. And so originally I had thought that I might do this in a color, but the actual natural color of the paper mache is so appealing to me. It's really quiet, it's really calm, and it's very warm. And so once I sort of saw what it was looking like, then from there we decided just to accent it with a very French blue. And the reason I say a French blue is because it has quite a bit of yellow in it again. So anything that has more red in it that is a blue tends to read more like a cobalt. This has a lot more sort of yellow and green in it, and so it's a much cooler, almost sort of Delft pale blue. And that's really the only color in this space other than the ceiling, which is also paper mache. One of the most important design elements of this room is actually something that we decided to do when we were installing these wall treatments, and that is that throughout my home you'll see many beams which are both load-bearing and historical and therefore cannot be moved. This room is one of the few rooms that didn't have that, and so when we conceptualized this space and we're giving it sort of a new access on which to frame out, we thought of the fireplace as being the center, even though it wasn't traditionally that. And so we put this beam in decoratively, as they say, because it's not load-bearing at this point in time, and created sort of a vibe so that when we do walk from here into the kitchen, you'll understand that those beams are repeated throughout the course of the first floor of this home. One of the other things I love about this room so much is these antique chairs. They're one of the first things that I ever purchased as a young adult. They're covered in a faux alligator, and they are sort of a glee or like a grayed out white French chair, and I love them. They have always felt to me like almost a little bit masculine, which I love, and I'm crazy about them. For this room, one of the other things I wanted to do is sort of play up the way that we're balancing masculine and feminine. And so to me, that was choosing a very traditional, like a ticking stripe. This happens to be Schumacher, one of my very favorites, Cherie stripe. And then doing something with it that was more interesting in the sense that it's a traditional skirted cloth, and then at the bottom, it's got this really flouncy, interesting ruffle, which to me makes it much more interesting than it would be if it were just a seam. This piece is one of my most favorite pieces. I love it so much that I'm never 100% sure if I want to cover it in something, and it is historical, and so right now it's got this great sort of loose applique of this silk, and I like the fact that it's something different on the sides and the back than it is on the cushion. That's one of the things I like best about it. This space was originally what they would have used for all of their sort of cooking purposes in the home, and so it's got this amazing huge fireplace, has really amazing old cool hardware, and then you'll probably note it's also got some really large logs in the fireplace. We could not find anything that made sense. Every piece of wood that I put into this fireplace looked like it had been eaten up, and so this is actually an amazing set of wood which was brought back from Vermont in the back of a car and almost caused the bar not to make it back because it was so low and so heavy, and those are going to live here for the rest of their lives because they can never be moved. So the fireplace mantle, the side pieces are again the paper mache, and then this is a really simple shelf that I chose because I wanted this just to sort of go away. It gives me a place to sort of have interesting things that I love, like this collection of silver. And then very purposefully, this is a piece of antiqued mirror, which was installed as a trumeau behind the paper mache. I didn't want it to be a furniture element. I wanted it to be an architectural element. Similar to that, I sort of wanted to play with different experiences of light. And so even though this is a colonial home, I fell in love with this vintage pair of Nearman Weeks, which are these incredible sort of almost brass art deco beaded sconces, which to me just, again, this room feels a little bit magical at all times of day, but particularly in the evening. And there's something about this light which almost feels like you're underwater. It's really special. One of the other things I love in this room is this clock. It is such a beautiful old French clock. I love it so much. It's Italianate, so even though it's French, it has an Italian sort of heritage in the way that it was created. And I will tell you that occasionally, even though it's non-functional and largely decorative, it decides to chime in the middle of the night or in the middle of the afternoon and scare all of us to death. So it hasn't given up the ghost, so we won't give up on it either. One of the things about this room that is different than any other room in my home is that I've chosen to light it from a couple of different vantage points. So not only do I have the sconces over the fireplace and the chandelier over the main table, but because this wall treatment is 3D in nature, one of the things I love most about it is lighting it from underneath. So I have these spotlights set out around the room, and most of them are in corners and they highlight interesting things, but it gives you this really great shadow play and reinforces the 3D nature of this branch. I love a bar cart. I love it even more when it used to be a French gardening table, as this one did. I'm a big lover of crystal and silver, which you've probably picked up on by now. And so I love old school cut crystal decanters. I love silver with patina. These are some beautiful glasses, which my parents gave to me that they got in Venice. Very, very wonderful. And then the second shelf of this is sort of a utilitarian function. I like baskets, I like linens, I like all of those things. And so having them sort of all here in one place makes it both usable and, to me, like an interesting adjunct. As it relates to entertaining, I would say that I both enjoy a casual mix and also really love it to feel elevated. So ways that I would say that it's almost always elevated are I love an amazing floral, always have really well-starched linens. I love china, have a really crazy china collection. But then at the same time, I will often, choose to serve something that is sort of a more traditional homey feeling. Like, we may be eating in this beautiful boiserie Narnia fairyland, but we may well be having like a chicken pot pie. Oh, I love decorating my own home. We call it the test kitchen. And I always say to my clients and my team, your own home is the only place where you really get to do what you want to do. And so for me, it is absolute freedom to scratch an itch with a particular fabric that I love, or try a color scheme that it might be more difficult to convince a client is a good idea. And because of that, and because it's so personal in nature, it feels like not only an expression of what I would like to do professionally, but an expression of who I am personally. So here we are in the kitchen of my 1790s Colonial, and I phrase it that way because you'll note that this is the room in the home that has the lowest ceilings. This is a room of our home that obviously is the beating heart, and it gets a ton of action and a ton of traffic, and it was never going to be sort of a modern, gray, white, expansive kitchen. And so a few years ago, I decided that instead of feeling like a kitchen, it might need to feel like a library. And so I painted all the cabinetry and the woodwork in this whole room black, which was a real leap of faith and one that I've never regretted. I also did the countertops in a really interesting marble. It's a Calcutta viola, and much like its name implies, it does have a little bit of purple and blue in it, which I find really interesting, and it has a lot of movement, which to me, because there isn't very much stone in this room, was very important. I also chose to do our main kitchen table in a painted decorative finish. Our incredible decorative painter here in New York, Shelley Denning, did this tortoise shell, which has a lot of movement and interest and color and tonal variation. And then the chairs around it are obviously sort of a familiar kitchen workhorse, which is the old school gingham. What ties all of these colors together for me is the choice of the wallpaper. This is, some might say, the least practical thing I've ever done in my life, which is put a white silk wallpaper in my kitchen. But this was several years ago now, and I have never regretted it. I love the way that this wallpaper not only has that texture because it's the silk, but it also has such an interesting palette of a warm brown, a charcoal gray, a deep black, and then this really interesting multi-set of blues. So you have cornflower, a little bit of Delft, and then even like a little bit of teal in the darkest accent. And to me, it's just, I absolutely love it. Every single day when I walk down here, it makes me happy. So not only do we have this sort of built-in area which allows you to take advantage of as much space as possible around that oval table, but we also have little things like I've done here, which is putting in a little extra spot for us to put our shoes on in the morning. My girls are always sitting here with the dog doing math homework. And so that really gives us another place to sort of rest as we're in this kitchen. This is a structural beam. One of the things that I loved about this home was the old sort of character of all of these natural elements. What I didn't love was the color of the wood that I inherited, which was quite browny red is how I would describe it. Not terribly pretty in my opinion. And so I spent, I don't know, maybe 47 hours lime waxing this probably 200 plus year old structural beam, because I will tell you that 200 plus year old wood is very thirsty, and that was a lot of lime wax. One of the things about this kitchen, again, that is a little different than almost any other room of my home is that there were actual overhead lights as a result of them having dropped this ceiling at some point in history. So this is one of the few places I got to pick some lights, and what I chose are these incredible Hadley pendants from Christopher Spitzmiller, who is just such an incredibly talented friend, and they're such beautiful light fixtures. I love them, and I particularly love how warm the light is from them because they have this gold foil inside, and so it makes this really warm thing as opposed to feeling cold or clinical in any other way. The other thing I would say is probably of note in this kitchen is that I do really love a good houseplant. Some of them are newer and some of them have been with us for quite some time. I love a topiary collection, which is always, in my opinion, a very chic and elegant way to have herbs just sort of at the ready. Some of these are edible and some are not. Please take note that I'm not suggesting you eat them. And then others have been with us for quite some time. For instance, this is what we like to call the big green people eater. And I put this in 12 years ago, and it has grown so much and so fast that it gets probably a quarterly haircut, because otherwise you really can't make toast here in the morning. Under the subject of having done much of this house by myself, what I wanted to do when I moved in here 15 years ago was to find antiqued Mercury backsplash. That did not exist when I conceptualized it. And so I bought sheet mirror and used a dissolving technique on the back of it and created my own backsplash and then installed it myself. And I will say I'm so happy with how it looks. It was a wonderful experience, but I'm also thrilled that Ann Saxon Waterworks now do it for us. I like to collect a lot of things. One of the things I love to collect is china. So I have a massive collection, and because I have really limited storage in the kitchen, I actually swap them out on a seasonal basis. So in the kitchen at any given time is that season's china and when we might use it. So for instance, one thing we really love and use quite a bit here in the spring is this beautiful Janori green with this very deep blue. And we love that. And we will often use that with something like this for a little breakfast setting. So why don't you guys follow me upstairs and we can take a look at some of the bedrooms. And here we are in the primary bedroom. So the primary bedroom is a good example of knowing yourself and knowing that to which you gravitate. For me personally, it felt like the right thing for this room is for it to feel really enveloping. So this is a wallpaper, actually it's a fabric from Benison, which I had paper backed. I fell in love with it. Again, sort of both the movement of the floral and also a really interesting mix of colors is the reason why I gravitated toward it. It has some purple, it has some pale blue, it has pink, it has red, and then it has this really grounding natural color. And so all of those are sort of why I wanted this to feel like it was completely covered. It's not a huge room, and some people probably wouldn't have done that which I did, which is to do a canopied bed. But to me, this was sort of the point for it to feel like it was wrapping its arms around you. This bed is a bed that has traveled with me in almost every iteration of my life. It's an antique French bed, which I bought at auction 18 years ago, and my mother actually helped me decoratively paint it in this amazing Swedish blue-gray. It started out its life as yellow, and it's one of my most favorite things, both for the memory and the sentiment, but also because I think it's really beautiful. The bed itself is covered in this great stark fabric. I chose to run this fabric the opposite direction that it would normally run because I wanted it to have interest horizontally as opposed to vertically. Again, I do love a good oil painting, so it was important to me that a lot of my collection find a home, and they have done that here in the primary. So I love hanging something like a piece of art on top of a soft fabric, like either a curtain or in an interesting way, like on top of a bookcase. Another aspect of this canopy bed, which makes me happy every single night and every single morning, is the detail work that I designed for underneath the canopy, which is something that you see only when you're in bed. Because this home is so historic, we have fireplaces in 4 of our major rooms, the primary suite being one of them. This particular fireplace doesn't work, which means that it gets to just hold my collection of vintage oil paintings. This one is one of my very most favorites. We call her my spirit animal. She is definitely a character. And I love her, and I love sort of the layer of interesting things that we have here. When it is not a terribly dark day, this room gets a ton of light. And so as a result of that, it was easy for us to conceptualize of doing things that were a little bit lighter and brighter in here. One of the things that I love when you have a room that has a more formal aspect, like having, 8 sets of silk lampshades, is to do something unexpected like a jute floor covering. In this instance, it gives us both tonal variation, which is very forgiving for a house full of children and dogs, but it also gives us texture and interest, and believe it or not, it's incredibly soft underfoot, and so it's a terrific selection for a primary suite because you're most often barefoot. One of the other things that I would say about this room is that I love this chair. It has been suggested to me that perhaps at some point I might need to recover it. This is a gorgeous silk cotton velvet, which is just like the most special. And as you can see, it has been loved and loved and loved. But I think the fact that it doesn't appear new is one of the things that I love most about it. So one other thing that I love in this room, because I do believe that the primary is probably the place for all things sentimental, is this incredible piece of artwork, which is a charcoal sketch, which was done by my grandfather, Stanford Horn, who was a very talented artist. So here we are in my eldest daughter's room. This room came about because about 4.5 years ago, she told me that she wanted tigers on her walls. And she is just old enough at that point to have found Google and was showing me all sorts of tiger decals and things that she had in mind. And so I said, I think that we can accomplish that, but in a way that will make both of us happy. And the solution to that is this wallpaper, which I really love, from Pierre Frey. And one of the things I like most about it is that it's very unexpected for a little girl's room. My daughter has a very strong personality in the best way possible. And so having black in this room made a ton of sense as it relates to her personality. I like the fact that it doesn't feel precious. I love the fact that it's a hand-blocked batik. And because it's printed on this really lovely linen paper, it also has texture and interest. These beds are actually the beds that have served now at least 2 generations of dreaming girls in my family. They were mine when I was young and I grew up with them, and I love them so much that at a young age I asked my parents to save them for me so that my children could have them, and lucky me, they did. We covered them in a fabric from Schumacher, which is a really interesting, it's almost a mat-lisse. It's got both texture, but then it also brings in this sort of really interesting smoky black and a little bit of chocolate brown. This is a great fermoir fabric, so we had these canopies made and they sort of bring that corally red color out, which I love so much, and they give a little bit of interest and they draw the eye up in this room because we don't have terribly high ceilings. One of the other things that was important in this room is that we had both form and function. So in this space, because it's an old home, we don't have a ton of closets. And so we needed something that would serve her sort of growing storage needs, but also could function as a place where she could curl up and read a book. So having a custom window seat made that would house not only toys for when she was younger, but books that now she's older, where she can curl up and do math problems, was really important. Similar to that, instead of doing a very traditional dresser setup, we wanted to use the height all the way up in this room for storage purposes. So not only does she have a desk set up here and some storage for clothing underneath, but she also gets to display my vintage collection of Nancy Drew. So this is one of the connecting spaces in our home. And I would say one of the things about connecting spaces that is often the case is they are overlooked. In our case, we couldn't overlook it because you can see it from the front hall. And so what started out as a camouflage movement, which is that we had this sort of old school beadboard here in these walls, and I couldn't figure out what to do with it. So the first thing I did is I decoratively painted it in this chocolate brown and cream stripe. But then I was left with a very unusual problem, which is that our ceiling felt boring. So what I ended up doing is creating this really cool trompe-l'oeil where from the bottom stairs, walking all the way up, and when you're in the room, it feels like this is tented. And we took that a step further, of course, because I can't help myself. It's an occupational hazard. And we tinted all of our light fixtures in an opposing stripe, covered this adorable piece of furniture, which gets about as much use as anything in my home, in this wonderful quadrille, and used these incredible old French Art Deco sconces. Last but not least, I framed all of these myself and did the matting for them myself with an X-Acto knife when I was probably 29 years old. So Lord knows they had to find somewhere to go in the house. So of all the rooms in this old house that needed our love and attention the most, this is probably the one that was the scariest. When I first looked at this home, it had fake wood beams all the way across the ceiling. There wasn't a single straight line in sight, and somebody had been using it for amateur taxidermy, so there was also quite a lot of stuffed animals in the room, and by stuffed I don't mean the good kind. And so the idea of conceptualizing this as a nursery and now bedroom for my youngest child took a little bit more imagination than some of the other rooms. I started with this incredible David Hicks wallpaper, which again is that saffron yellow, which I love so much. I think I've mentioned that once or twice, but I didn't want it to feel too sweet. So I mixed that with some darker pieces of furniture, some chinoiserie, and some things that sort of gave it grounding and depth because I didn't want it to feel overly saccharine. Then we had to tackle the floor plan. There are a lot of windows and a lot of doors in this room, and therefore not a lot of wall space. So one of the elements of this room that makes it so functional for the way that we live is this built-in, which I designed. So not only do we have the storage on either side for her books and stuffed animals and all of those things, but then in between that, we're able to accommodate another set of drawers underneath the bed, and then this very functional, super comfortable from firsthand experience bed, which functions as sort of both a day bed and then also, just sort of a place to hang out in this room. One of the other things about this space that's very unusual is that we chose to treat the ceiling as the fifth wall. So when I first papered this, we only went up to this point. And it felt like something was missing. And so we had to take the whole thing down again and start over with the paper and include the ceiling in it. Because without that, you lose this sort of wonderful warm feeling of being inside this cocoon, which to me is an important design aspect of the space. One of the things about this space that I love so much is the ability to use textiles that I really gravitate towards. And as it happens, this also happens to be something that my daughter loves so much. This is a sewn Britain, incredible fabric that we adore that is covering this really, really sweet, perfectly scaled chair for this bedroom. And I just think the whole thing just feels both accidental and intentional, which to me is maybe the best kind of design. I always use the word home instead of the word house because to me, a home is the backdrop for the memories that you create and the backdrop for the life that you live. A house is a structure. And to me, the ability to live in a home is what really matters.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to go to homeworthy.com for exclusive content, shopping guides, and so much more.